Welcome to Intentionality with Paul Kempff, the podcast and YouTube channel where we explore the possibilities and opportunities that can be created by a more intentional life. This is episode 37. Now, before I get started with the topic of today's podcast, I need to give you a disclaimer. I've just arrived back from the airport after a trip to Cape Town to see a few of our clients. This has undoubtedly been one of the busiest weeks of my life. And unfortunately, for today's episode, I have not done enough preparation. I've got the content, no worries on that. I've done the research, I've done the work, but I simply have not had enough time to memorize everything that I want to share with you today. And there's really, in my opinion, so much valuable information that I don't want to miss out on, that I am going to read off from my iPad a little bit more in this episode than I normally do. Those of you listening on podcasts won't mind because you can't see me. So this disclaimer is really just for our YouTube viewers. Now, something interesting happened to me a week ago. I was invited to go and talk at a leadership event of a company. Now, I was invited by a friend, somebody I've known for more than 20 years, to come and do this talk. And after the talk, this person said something that really got me thinking. And it was the following. They said, "Paul, when did you become such an interesting and likable person? When did you change into this pleasant person we saw today?" Now, obviously, it's a nice thing to hear, but there's a hidden message in there that we need to acknowledge. This is really just a nice way of saying, Paul, 20 years ago, you were not such a nice person. You were not a pleasant person. And actually, you were a bit of an arrogant arsehole. And that gave me a great idea for a new podcast. And that is also the name of this podcast today. How to stop being an arrogant arsehole from personal experience. Now, this conversation and this topic made me think of a conversation I had with my mother more than 20 years ago. And this conversation that took place with my mother happened at a time in my life when everything wasn't great, when everything wasn't going well. And I will never forget this conversation, no matter how long ago it happened. During this conversation, my mom said to me that I'm not a very nice person. And she did it in the most loving and most nicest way that I think she could possibly do it. But she spoke to me about the fact that I wasn't a very engaging person. And it's a conversation that I really took to heart because it bothered me that my own mother, who's supposed to think the world of me, said I wasn't a very nice person, not a very engaging person. And then a few years later, when I started working at the FFG group of companies, a similar type of thing happened. Somebody very early on in my career at FFG was brave enough to tell me that I'm a bit of a stuck-up snob, that I was unapproachable, sometimes almost rude, essentially a bit of an arrogant arsehole. Now, I know I am the nicest person I know. Just kidding. I do realize, and I did realize at that time, that I needed to make some changes. That if I didn't want to be known as an arrogant arsehole for the rest of my life, I needed to do things differently. And that's when I began to make some intentional changes, to be more likable, to be less of an arrogant arsehole. And I just thought, maybe there are a few more arrogant arseholes out there who could actually learn something from my own personal experience and my own journey in doing things to be more likable. And in my opinion, this whole journey starts with probably the most difficult part, and that is realization. Realizing the truth about yourself and admitting it and taking responsibility for it. Because I do think there's a few arrogant assholes walking around out there who maybe don't realize it yet, who don't know who they are. So the first step is identifying the problem, realizing it yourself, admitting it, and taking responsibility for it. I think the next step in the process is having the desire to do something about it. Because here's something interesting I found in the last 37 episodes of Intentionality with Paul Kempff. You can do what you want to try and change people. You can tell people to change. You can give them ways to change. You can give them advice and tools. If somebody does not want to change, they will not change. People have to have that desire in themselves, the desire to do something about it before they will actually start changing. But if that genuine desire to change is there, and if you're intentional in your effort to change, it is possible. The next step is to then realize why you are being perceived by other people as disengaged, as unlikable, as arrogant, or even an arrogant arsehole. So what is it that you can do differently, intentionally, so that people will start perceiving you differently? Not all at once, but slowly, gradually, over time. Again, the law of accretion getting to work in becoming more likable. What is it that I have tried? What has been my own personal experience? And what is it that has worked well? And this is where I would like to talk to you today about the concept of blind spots. Now, let's start off by just quickly looking at the dictionary definition of a blind spot. A blind spot is a lack of insight or awareness, often persistent, about a specific area of one's behavior or personality, typically because recognition of one's true feelings and motives would be painful. Now, if we think about blind spots and we start off by thinking about emotional blind spots, it's interesting to note that unfortunately, nobody in life is required to take a class on what emotions are and how they work before we can actually start living. And this means we go through life with emotional blind spots we're not aware of, and we have no way to compensate for them. These emotional blind spots can lead to everything from mood difficulties like anxiety and depression to interpersonal conflict and unhealthy habits. There's a quote from a guy called Alan Locos that I'm going to read to you. He says, "Many times we assume, we even believe that our thoughts are reality, that our values are the highest, that our beliefs the absolute truth, and our way of thinking the only possible way. We believe, or like to believe, that our ideas are rational, and that the ideas of others are inconsistent. These immovable certainties usually come from our psychological blind spots, and they do not add points in our favor. On the contrary, they subtract." Now, aside from emotional blind spots, we also have something called bias blind spots. And in 2002, a group of social psychologists from Princeton University referred to bias blind spots and a study around bias blind spots that they did. And they said bias blind spots is our inability to recognize the impact of our biases and limitations on our judgment, behavior, and decisions. Although we do not have problems to recognize them in others, which indicates that it is not a matter of ignorance, but rather of a motivated ignorance to protect the image that we have formed of ourselves. The problem with psychological blind spots is that we assume these biases are trustworthy, thinking that we are immune to them, so we deceive ourselves, labeling others as biased while we believe that we are objective and impartial. Everything that we deny about us weakens us because it prevents us from growing, making us assume a more immature and maladjusted position. Luckily, it's possible to become aware of your psychological and emotional blind spots and do something to overcome them. Now, the first step there is obviously to recognize these blind spots. You need to stop assuming that others see what you see, feel what you feel, and think what you think, because this is rarely the case. Don't underestimate your propensity to have conversational blind spots. Start paying attention to and minimizing the time you own a conversational space. When you are in an intense meeting trying to defend your position and start to feel yourself losing ground, we often find ourselves talking louder. We talk over colleagues, correcting their point of view. They push back, so you try to convince everyone you're right. It sometimes feels like an almost out-of-body experience. And in many ways it is. In terms of neurochemistry, your brain is being hijacked. Or if we can put it differently, your brain is getting hooked on something. It's getting hooked on being right. Now, in situations of high stress, fear, or distrust, the hormone and neurotransmitter cortisol floods the brain. Executive functions that help us with advanced thought process like strategy, trust building, and compassion shuts down. And the amygdala, our instinctive brain, takes over. The body makes a chemical choice about how to best protect itself. In this came from shame and loss of power associated with being wrong. And as a result, we are unable to regulate our emotions or handle the gaps between expectations and reality. So we obviously default to one of the 4 responses: fight, flight, freeze, or appease. These harmful responses prevent the honest and productive sharing of information and opinions. And I find the fight response to be by far the most damaging to relationships. It is also, unfortunately, the one that's the most common. And that's partly due to another neurochemical process. When you argue and win, your brain floods with adrenaline and dopamine, which makes you feel good, dominant, even invincible, which contributes to you being an arrogant arsehole. It's a feeling that we want to replicate. So the next time we're in a tense situation, we fight again, and thus become addicted to being right. Many successful leaders suffer from this addiction. They are skilled at fighting for their point of view, which is often right, and yet they are unaware of the dampening impact their behavior has on those around them. Luckily, there's another hormone which is as effective in making you feel good as adrenaline. It's called oxytocin. Oxytocin is activated by human connections. It opens up our networks in our brains or in our prefrontal cortex, increasing our ability to trust and open ourselves to sharing. Your goal should be to spur the production of oxytocin in yourself and others while avoiding the spikes of cortisol and adrenaline. So let's end off looking at blind spots by looking at ways in which we can achieve this. Create more oxytocin, less cortisol and adrenaline. So 3 exercises that you can try to cure your addiction of being right is, firstly, set the rules of engagement. If you head into a meeting that could get difficult, outline the rules of engagement. Secondly, listen. But don't just listen with compassion. In one-on-one conversations, make a conscious effort to speak less and listen more. The more you learn about other people's perspectives, the more likely you are to feel compassion for them. And when you do that for others, they'll want to do it for you, creating a virtuous cycle. And then third, plan who speaks. In situations when you know that one person is likely to dominate a conversation, create opportunities for everyone to speak. So how do we overcome emotional blind spots? I'm going to mention a few ways in which you can do that. Increased self-awareness is the first one. Emotional intelligence is far more likely when we have increased self-awareness. We often can't see the areas that are hindering us because we can't be objective with ourselves. Seek advice. Seek help. Practice appreciation. Some people call it gratitude or thankfulness. Learning to be grateful will put you in a different emotional state. Without appreciation, we often find ourselves stuck in a negative emotional loop, and the blind spots are only magnified. Be patient. It's not easy making these changes. It's something that will happen gradually over time. And give attention to where you want to go, not to where you've been. When it comes to energy, you have the choice to focus on the positive or dwell on the negative. Focusing on the positive will uplift everything else in your life and everyone around you. Once you know where the emotional blind spots are, do everything you can to remove them or minimize them. Emotional blind spots are a part of life, but so is managing them. And once you identify them and appreciate where they've come from, you can adjust where you're going. Right, that's enough about blind spots. The last thoughts I want to share with you around how to not be an arrogant arsehole is really this. Ever since that conversation I had with my mother, ever since that colleague at FFT told me many years ago that they didn't think I was a very nice person, I've been intentionally on a journey to try and change that perception in people's minds. And what I can tell you today is I'm certainly not the nicest person I know, but I do think I have made some progress in moving away from that perception that people had of me many years ago. And I want to tell you that it is possible through intentional behavior, through recognizing your blind spots, to become less of an arrogant arsehole. So today's tip of the week is going to be a longer one than normal. I want to end off with a tip of the week that actually is related to this topic that I'm discussing, the topic of being less of an arrogant arsehole. And the content of this tip of the week really comes from a podcast that I have recommended before. This podcast, by the way, has recently been again rated as South Africa's top rated podcast. It's called The Expansive. And in this podcast, there was an episode where they spoke about networking. It was actually called a masterclass in networking. And I think it fits in very well with the topic that I'm discussing today. Now, in this topic, it was more about selling and networking and business. And I just want to use few of the examples that they used in this masterclass, but apply it to life in general. And to doing things in a way that will make you more likable to people. Now, the first one was to think about a story and to think about telling a story. It's very important to understand whenever somebody meets you in their life, they immediately form a story about you in their head. That story could be one of you are friendly, you are cold, you are warm, you are arrogant, you are caring, you're self-absorbed, intelligent, even smelly, handsome, rude, kind. These are thoughts that people get when they meet you, things they think about you the moment that they meet you. Now, if you think about this, how would you describe a person if the interaction you have with them is very brief? Don't you also form an opinion, a story about them in your head? Do you immediately start thinking this person could be a friend or not a friend? I'll trust this person or I won't distrust this person? It's important to understand that if you do that, everybody else is doing that about you. Everybody else is ultimately forming a story of you in their head. And it's important that you understand that you have the power to write that story in the way you want it to be written. You can influence that story. You can impact that story in the heads of other people. And that could determine the kind of relationship you have with people and how people perceive you. So I'm going to end off as the tip of the week, just giving you a few tips on how you can write that story better. So the first one, quite obvious one, very simple one, ask more questions, ask better questions. Try to get to know somebody really, truly, authentically, in a warm, engaging way by asking them questions. Don't interrogate, just ask questions in a warm, authentic way. There was a talk on a TED talk by a guy called Carl Fassman, who said, change your questions, change your life. And he plays a game with a crowd where he says, you must turn to a stranger next to you and then you must ask that person a question. But you're not allowed to ask them how they are doing. And the question that he suggested you ask that person is, who is your best friend and why? Now think about this. When we meet somebody for the first time, we tend to say, hi, how are you doing? It's not a very engaging question. But the moment you ask a question like, who is your best friend and why? That person has to start thinking about the answer. They have to think about why a person would be their best friend. And that person will automatically connect this unexpected question and the dots to this unexpected question with you. It'll become a memorable question, and you will become memorable to that person. People feel grateful if you create an environment for them to share and for them to not feel pressure that they have to come up with things to talk about. So there's a relaxation for them in that process when you show genuine interest in them. And by the way, did you know that you can actually Google interesting questions if you don't really know what interesting questions to ask? A few other tips would be to say somebody's name in a conversation. Dale Carnegie always said the sweetest sound a person can hear is their own name. So try and say somebody's name more often. Look someone in the eye. Bill Clinton was famous for this. When he looked at you when he was having a conversation with you, he would look you in the eye and he would make you feel like the only person that mattered to him. Make a deliberate point of looking people in the eye and be warm and engaging in your facial expressions. I've been told when I do this podcast, I don't smile enough, I frown too much. It's certainly something that I still have to work on. And then, of course, smile and be intentional about it. People feel differently about you. They perceive you differently when you have a smile on your face. And then my final tip for being more likable is try and find the hidden passion of a person you're talking to. Whether it's somebody you meet for the first time, whether it's an old friend. When you can figure out what someone's hidden passion is and they start talking about it, they come alive. And when they come alive, they open up, they feel warm, and they feel comfortable towards you. I know it's a long tip that I've given you. We've come to the end of this podcast, but I do want to end off with a short quote for all of the arrogant arseholes that are still listening and maybe not yet convinced to change. I read this quote last week in a book that I'm reading. It's a quote by an oil tycoon that I've never heard of. His name is T. Boone Pickens, and he said, "Success has its own gravity. The higher the monkey climbs the tree, the more you can see his ass." So, to all the arrogant assholes out there, I hope you found a message in today's podcast. I hope you are prepared to make the intentional changes that are necessary to be more likable. Thank you to the production team for all their hard work behind the scenes. Thank you to the sponsors of this podcast, the FFG Group. Thank you for your support and helping us build something amazing. All that is left is to congratulate yourself on making the choice to live a more intentional life, to be the architect of your own success. Thank you for listening, and may the rest of your week be an amazing intentional journey.